For a lot of millennials and Gen Z, their real English teacher wasn't a person. It was a Game Boy, PlayStation, or computer. If you ask people from non-English speaking countries how they got fluent, many of them will tell you the same story over and over again. They didn't learn it in a classroom. They learned it without really noticing. They learned it because if they didn't, they couldn't catch that Pokémon. They couldn't complete that quest in World of Warcraft. They couldn't understand the mission in GTA. For an entire generation, fluency wasn't the goal. It was just a side effect of wanting to play. Today I want to dig into the research of video games and language learning to see if it's just nostalgia that I completely share or if video games are truly a great way to learn a language. And spoiler alert, the science is a lot more complicated than just play games and get fluent, but also a lot more interesting and at times counterintuitive. If you grew up playing video games in English without English being your first language, you probably know exactly what I'm talking about. That moment where you realize you understood something without translating it in your head. Or when you used a word in an essay that you definitely didn't learn in school. You learned it from a quest description or item tooltip. And if you search for this online, you will find thousands of people saying the same thing. Pokémon taught me to read English. I learned more from RuneScape than 6 years of English class. World of Warcraft gave me vocabulary my teacher had never heard of. I can absolutely relate to this and believe that I've learned more English from video games and watching Let's Plays than from any other study method I've used. While nostalgia surely plays a huge role here, researchers have actually been studying this. Swedish universities have been running studies on gaming and language acquisition for over a decade. And what they found is, well, it's complicated. Because yes, games can teach you a language, but not all games, and maybe not in the way you might think. Let me show you. The most comprehensive research on this comes from Scandinavia, and there's a reason for that. The Scandinavian countries consistently rank among the top countries for English proficiency, despite English not being an official language. Swedish researchers wanted to know why. Pia Sundqvist and Liz Kerstin Sylvan at Karlstad University have been studying the connection between gaming and English skills since the 2000s. They looked at Swedish 9th graders, around 15 years old, and compared their gaming habits to their English test scores. The finding? Students who game more than 5 hours per week in English significantly outperformed those who didn't game at all. And it wasn't just slightly better. The difference was measurable in vocabulary size, reading comprehension, and even the complexity of words they used. But here's where it gets interesting. A Norwegian study looked at over 10,000 students and found something strange. Some students scored below 20% on Norwegian reading tests, their native language, but above 60% on English reading tests. When researchers interviewed these kids, they had one thing in common. The outlier informants acknowledged playing online games more than 3 hours each day. Okay, so correlation is clearly there, but correlation is not causation, right? Maybe kids that are good in English just happen to play more video games. Well, researchers also looked at why games seem to work so well, and they identified a few key things. First, context. When you see a treasure chest and the game says open chest, you learn what chest means, without anyone explaining it. The visual does the work. You're getting vocabulary in context, attached to images and actions, not abstract definitions. The findings of Chen and Zhu demonstrated that the effectiveness of vocabulary learning is primarily attributed to repeated exposure to target vocabulary and the immersive nature of the game environment. And teachers agree with this. The study of Alpahide on online vocabulary games revealed that 97% of teachers strongly agreed on the benefits of online games for vocabulary learning. You're not learning because your teacher told you to. You're learning because you want to understand what's going on. You want to know what's happening. You want to finish the quest. You want to know why your Sims are upset. The motivation is built into the experience. All interviewees agreed that games increased their English vocabulary mainly because of the strong motivation to look up the words and phrases in a dictionary to continue playing. Third, repetition without boredom. The word inventory might appear 500 times across a game. But it never feels like you're drilling flashcards, because each time it appears in a slightly different context and it's within the game. Same with health, quest, damage, equipped. You see these words constantly, but organically. I wanted to understand the text in World of Warcraft, so I often needed to look up the vocabulary while playing. The more the particular vocabulary item appeared, the better I could understand it. This is crucial. Linguist Stephen Krashen talks about the effective filter. Basically, If you're anxious or stressed, you're not ready to learn. Research from Reindeers and Watana found that games lower this filter. Because you're playing as a character, you have a layer of anonymity. If you make a grammar mistake in a chat or misread a quest, you just try again. Games create a psychologically safe environment. You can fail, you can misunderstand, you can take your time, and nobody's gonna judge you. There's no classroom embarrassment. However, that really depends on the game. In many multiplayer games, there's a lot of judging going on, and they also don't offer a low-pressure environment, which is a perfect transition to the next section. Here's where the research gets complicated and honestly kind of funny. You might assume that the best games for learning are the ones where you talk to people, right? MMOs like World of Warcraft, where you're chatting with thousands of other players. Well, a 2022 meta-analysis of 26 different studies found something completely counterintuitive. Single-player games were actually more effective for learning than multiplayer games. Wait, what? Here's the theory. It all boils down to cognitive overload. When you're in a raid in World of Warcraft or a match in League of Legends, there is too much happening. You're trying to survive, you're trying to coordinate. Your brain is so busy processing the gameplay that it doesn't have the bandwidth to process the language in a way that it can learn and remember. Single-player games, on the other hand, let you pause. You can stare at a dialogue box for 5 minutes if you need to. You can look up a word. You have time to think. It turns out that pause button is one of the most powerful language learning tools we have. But it gets weirder. There was a study done on a game called Parappa the Rapper, which is a single-player game. Researchers had one group play the game and the other group just watch someone else play it. The result? The people who just watched learned significantly more vocabulary than the people playing. Again, it's the cognitive load. If you know the game, it's hard to imagine why this would be an awful choice for learning a language. The players were so focused on hitting the buttons in rhythm that they tuned out the language. The watchers, on the other hand, could just focus on the input. And this actually explains a massive modern phenomenon. Let's Plays. How many of us have learned English not just by playing, but by watching others play the game? You get all the context, all the vocabulary, but without the stress of controlling the game. Okay, but I got one more big plot twist. The games that were designed for language learning performed worse than the games that were not. The meta-analysis showed that commercial entertainment games, the ones your parents might have told you were a waste of time, consistently outperformed educational games. Why? Because these educational games often and consistently fail the motivation test. They replace play with work. When you know you're studying, the magic disappears. You're not trying to save the princess anymore, you're trying to learn. And your brain knows the difference. This was a big motivator for me to create my own language learning app, Lengia. I wanted a tool that feels less like a textbook and more like reading a great novel, even if you don't have the adequate vocabulary yet to read regular novels. Lengia creates that same compelling input environment games do. You can import any content, books, articles, audio files, and then translate them to your target language and simplify them to your level. It gives you instant translations for words you don't know and turns that new vocabulary into smart flashcards with a single click. The flashcards then show up more often in new content so that you get repetition in fresh contexts. Like for example the daily stories that get created for you based on your interests. Lengia is designed to keep you in that flow state, where you focus on the book or podcast that you are interested in, not the struggle of learning. Because as we just learned, when you're enjoying the content, the language acquisition happens almost by accident. We recently launched a $1 trial, so visit lengia.com to try it out. Now let's find the formula for the perfect game. If educational games are boring and multiplayer games are too chaotic and some single-player games are too distracting, what actually works? If we look at all the research and all the stories, this is what emerges. The perfect language learning game is definitely not a flashcard app. It's a game that accidentally ticks 5 specific boxes. Number 1, language must be required. This is the Parappa the Rapper lesson. If you can play the game without reading, like a racing game or some platformers, you won't learn much. The best games are those where you literally cannot progress unless you understand what the character just said. Number 2, visual context. The best games act like a giant picture dictionary. In The Sims, you don't just see the word fridge. You click on a fridge, you see a character walk to the fridge, open the fridge, and take food out. Your brain maps the word to the object instantly. No translation needed. Number 3, the pause factor. We discussed this. You need time to process. This makes turn-based RPGs and point-and-click adventures into gold mines for language learning. You control the pace of the lesson. Number 4, maybe a little optional, but massive volume. We're talking about games you can basically live in. World of Warcraft, RuneScape, Persona, Final Fantasy. These games have scripts longer than most novels. You're not reading a chapter, you're reading the library. And number 5, intrinsic motivation. This is probably the most important one. You have to care. You have to care, you have to want to know what happens next. So don't play a game to learn. Play a game you want to play, just do it in your target language. For me, this was Stardew Valley. It's the first game I have completely played in Spanish, and it was perfect. It has everything. Visual context. I see the parsnip, I plant the parsnip. Time pauses whenever I'm in my inventory. Repetitive vocabulary, seasons, crops, tools. And I cared about the town and the characters because they are so well designed. What an amazing game, by the way. Never once felt I was studying. So if you take only one thing away from this video, let it be this. The most powerful language learning tool isn't a textbook. It's not a classroom. It's necessity mixed with fun. It's the frustration of being stuck in a game. It's the desire to understand the story. It's the refusal to let a language barrier stop you from having a good time. On the other hand, I do believe the way we learn languages is about to change even more drastically. I just released a video about the biggest language learning trends coming in 2026, so check that out next. Thank you for watching and let me know what game taught you English. See you next time.